Thanks. This is my favorite event. I've been coming for 20 plus years. I've lost count of how many years I've been coming, so it's been a while. So if you don't know who I am, I'm Richard Wright, which you might know. I wear a lot of hats. I'm contributing editor at Sky and Telescope, so you may see some stuff in there with my name on it. I also worked a long time for Software Bisque, representing them at star parties. And currently I have my own astronomy software consultancy company, helping vendors and myself developing astronomy products. But I also have a day job, or as my wife likes to say, the real job. I work in high-tech stuff. I do computer graphics and compute technologies. And that seems like a strange thing to talk about with Lucky Imaging, but compute and GPU technologies are becoming more and more important with astrophotography, and it's only become more so. In fact, last year's talk was about GPUs and compute technologies. So GPUs, just what is that? Graphics processing unit. So it's hardware in the computer that manipulates graphics. And when we talk about compute, compute is using that same hardware to do massively parallel things. So think about sorting 1 billion spreadsheet records in less than a second. You can do that using compute technologies built on the back of what started as GPUs. So anyway, that's my expertise, sort of. And I've been doing astrophotography for a really, really long time. And I write about it and blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to talk about Lucky Imaging today. State of the art in high resolution astronomical imaging. Some of you, I don't know what you thought this talk was going to be about, but I mean, this is obviously what it is. We'll give a kind of an overview of Lucky Imaging, what it is and how it works. I know some of you are already Lucky Imaging practitioners. Talk about some best practices and things that are going on, and what I think is interesting and going on for some people. People want to know what I think. So when it comes to astrophotography, one thing that really amazes your spouses and your nephews and your cousins and the muggles, right, is just how big a lot of deep sky targets are and how dim they are compared to the moon. So here's a photo I took of the moon and the Heart Nebula on the same evening. This is a 120-minute exposure of the Heart Nebula, and I don't remember the numbers, but I did the math, I promise. Very, very short exposure of the moon, also with the same filters. And did the math, okay, we call that, what do we call that? Astrometry? No, it's not astrometry. Okay, anyway, the moon is 800,000 times brighter than that nebula. So fundamentally, doing deep sky photography and taking pictures of things like the moon or the sun or the planet is a lot different. There's a lot of things that we can get away with really bright objects that we can't get away with really dim objects. Another challenge is, look how small the moon is compared to that deep sky object. The Andromeda Galaxy is 6 full moons across. The Crab Nebula fits right inside that moon. So we're usually shooting at very long focal lengths, and we want really, really sharp images. Now, so Lucky Imaging, bright objects, fundamentally different, except there are some things that don't change no matter what you're doing. I have to present this chart every time I give a talk because there is something called shot noise. And what shot noise is that noisy look that dim images have. If you take an image, forget about astrophotography. You're out at night and you got a camera and you take a picture of some friends and it's dark outside. You know that you're going to get a very noisy image, right? And so why do you have a noisy image? The number one answer is ISO. You've turned up the ISO and you get camera noise, and you have to have that ISO in order to get the image. That is the wrong answer. The answer is you don't have a lot of light. So this type of noise is an artifact of not a lot of light landing on your sensor. So when we do deep sky, we need to collect lots and lots of light to get a low noise image. And you might think we don't have to worry about that at all with like the sun, but it also comes into play with the sun and the moon and the planets as well. Again, I saw this, just have to get on the soapbox, get on it. I saw something in print about low ISO to prevent camera noise. This is an experiment you can do yourself. I wrote about it in an article a while back. If you shorten the ISO, most of the time when you shorten the ISO, your camera is doing what it needs to do, and it will shorten the exposure. So if you shorten the exposure and you get a noisy image, why did you get a noisy image? Because of this, shot noise. Shot noise is there's lots of sources of noise, but shot noise I think is the one we care the most about most of the time. All right. Oh, look, here it is. It's the devil. So here's a picture of the moon. You can see some craters, sort of, and this is like what shot noise looks like. So that's all this is this is kind of what shot noise looks like. And if you take a little bit longer exposure, you might have to raise the ISO to get a longer exposure. Then it starts getting clearer and clearer. It has nothing to do with your ISO. It actually has little to do with your camera gain and your offset and all the things people are worried about. The number one cause of this is how much light is landing on your sensor. All those little photons flying through the air, flying through everything, landing on your sensor. So the more light you collect, the deeper the exposure, and of course the more clear and less noisy it is. And this is just as true when you're shooting the moon as it is when you're shooting the planets, or when you're shooting the sun as it is when you're trying to take a hydrogen alpha exposure of some faint nebula somewhere. So, as I said, solar system objects are very small and very bright. This is another image I took on the same evening. I took Jupiter and Saturn were both out, and the moon was up. And I went to the moon, and okay, that's a nice picture. Let's try to get Saturn and Jupiter. And this is exactly the scale of how small these planets are compared to the moon. They get a little bigger and smaller depending on where we are in the orbits, but more or less this gives you a good ballpark figure. These are pretty small targets. And if you want a big picture of Saturn, then you've got to have a lot of focal length to get that image scale that you're going to want. And that focal length is going to give you a scale on how many arc seconds per pixel, things that would make deep sky photographers go, oh no, you can't do that. A tenth of an arc second per pixel, for example. You wouldn't even think about doing that with deep sky photography. So lucky imaging is typically constrained to solar system targets like the sun, the moon, and the planets, and also longer focal lengths. The great thing about lucky imaging is we don't care about light pollution. There is no amount of light pollution that is going to affect your solar photography. I guarantee if it is, we are in big trouble. All right? Same thing can really be said of the moon and the planets. I've never had, other than somebody's light glaring in your telescope, overall light pollution, bright sky is not going to affect it. Even, every time, oh, the moon's out, can't do nothing, like, what's wrong with the moon? The moon is an absolutely fantastic target. It's actually my favorite target to look at and to take pictures of. Passing clouds, last night, somebody was talking about their sea star. You know what you can do with a sea star? You can join the visual guys. You can go for sucker holes. Oh, that's clear over there. Let's just go over there and take some exposures. Oh, it's clear over there. Let's go over there and take some exposures. If clouds are coming through, I'm in the backyard. Okay, I get on Facebook for a while. I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook, but I'll do some work. I'll do some work or read a book. But the clouds will pass, and I'll get a nice clear spot. You got to be patient, and you can do a lot of. Lucky imaging is actually a lot more accessible than deep sky photography is, in the long and the short of things. So here's the problem. Let's get my animation going. See all this wiggling around? If you can't, it's wiggling around, okay? That's what the moon looks like when you look at it at high power through a telescope. So that's also what your deep sky photography looks like when you're trying to shoot the Heart Nebula or Thor's helmet or the Horsehead Nebula, and you've got a long focal length. This is what the Horsehead Nebula is doing too. It's going all over the place. It's doing all that wavy stuff. It's like trying to take a photo of something at the bottom of a swimming pool. And if the pool is nice and smooth, everything's good. Some little kid comes and does a cannonball. You can't see what's at the bottom of the swimming pool. You've got to wait for the water to calm down. The atmosphere is the same sort of thing. We have several miles worth of swimming pool over our head when we're trying to shoot these targets. The wider your field of view, the more this shrinks and the less troublesome it becomes. And you're like, well, that's fine. When the seeing's bad, do nightscapes, or put on a long focal length, a short focal length, and do wide field stuff. So this is what we want. I slowed it down. I don't know how well this is going to work. Nope. But I slowed down the animation, and you can see, like, this is very nice and sharp, and this is okay sharp, and then a minute later it shifts. So this crater actually is moving around, and so are all these other craters. And that's that's really awful. It's really awful. It's a little better. A minute ago it was really good, and now it's awful. So what you get with Lucky Imaging is you want to take lots of video frames, lots and lots of video frames, like hundreds or even thousands of frames. And then you go through each one, you just hit the little arrow key and you look each at those thousands of frames and you decide which part of the little frame is good and you keep that. Thank you for laughing. At least one person knows I'm being, a total jerk. Yeah, all right. No, we use software for that. So we're going to have, the computer is going to do that for you. But that's really what Lucky Imaging is. Go through, find the good frames. Sort of the very base approach is you could actually just sort all the frames. I do this on the moon every now and then. I just sort the frames by sharpness, and the sharpest frame is usually pretty good, and I can just use it. Current state of the art, they'll go through all the frames and take pieces of the frames that are sharp, and they'll combine all of those pieces together. And they'll even figure out how the craters are moving around and try to align those up for you. So, basic Lucky Imaging. Summary. Hundreds of thousands, hundreds to thousands. Don't take hundreds of thousands. Lost cause. You could pick the sharpest frame. Obviously, I know this, but I'm not paying attention to my own slides. Yes, this can work. Noise can be a factor. If you take the best frame and you try to sharpen it, there's a surprising amount of noise in that nice image. And you start sharpening it, and you want to get those details like Alan Friedman or the lunar orbiter or something going over. And those little details, those sharpening algorithms will get a hold of that little detail, then it'll turn it into a nice little spaceship or something on the surface of the moon that isn't actually there. So be careful with that. Combine the best frames. And even better, combine the best of multiple frames, the best parts of multiple frames. So here is one of my best shots. I shot with the moon straight overhead, 0.1 arc seconds per pixel. This was with a 150 millimeter refractor and a 4x power mate. It's kind of like a fancy Barlow. I'm not going to get into the differences, but there is an important difference. And so very small pixel scale. Now here's the thing. The diffraction limit of this telescope is 0.93 arc seconds. So how am I getting a pixel scale of 0.1 arc seconds per pixel? Not only can I beat the seeing, I can beat diffraction. I'm also being a jerk. Just, okay. Dawes limit is 0.77. So, it's like, how are you getting such a nice sharp image? You're basically beating diffraction. And at first I thought, well, if you take enough samples, I remember you could take a lot of coarse samples and average them and get a finer grain sample. There may be something true to that, but I don't think that's what's going on. I think there's a much simpler explanation, and that is, getting ahead of myself. That is, don't forget, this is after I have sharpened the image. This is not what the image looks like coming out of the telescope. This is what the image looks like after I've stacked a whole bunch of them and it's aligned them and put them all together. And this is not a very nice crisp image. Go back and forth. Nice crisp image. That's the end result, and I didn't actually keep this because it's old data, but I blurred it up, and that's about what it looks like. That's about what it looks like when it pops out of your software, and then you're going to go to work on that and make it really nice and sharp. So this, I have definitely not beat the diffraction limit with this image by any stretch of the imagination. So we'll get back to that point. Gear guide. What are you going to use to do this Lucky Imaging? I really like Lucky Imaging. I'll just say it again. It's actually so much easier than Deep Sky and takes a lot less time. I can go out in the backyard, set up, take some data on the moon, shut everything down, go in, process my data, and have a nice image or two or a handful and go to bed. It's still by midnight, all right? I can't do that. I'm up all night. Is the meridian flipped? You know, do I have enough data? Is it still tracking? It's actually a much funner way to do astrophotography. You're going to want a fast camera, USB 3 today. Use a USB 3 cable. I forgot to bring some examples, but USB-C, you've seen those cables with the little ends. USB-C does not mean USB 3, all right? And I'm not going to lie, software engineer, very accomplished in my field, that surprised me, all right? A long time ago, but it surprised me. That just because it's a USB-C cable does not mean it's a USB 3 cable, does not mean you will get fast transmission rates over that cable. So make sure you have a certified USB 3 cable going to a USB 3 camera so that you can get as many frames per second as you're going to want. Remember, fast exposures need more light. I remember a story about a vendor getting irritated by another editor at Sky and Telescope. Somebody came out with this camera and it's like 350 frames per second. It's like, well, that's great, but he put in his review, it's like, 350 seconds is great for, but he was shooting planets. And you can't get an image bright enough in 1/350th of a second, at least on his setup. So it didn't do any good, to have an exorbitant frame rate. So bear that in mind. You still need enough light to get some kind of a good exposure per frame. Long focal lengths, image scale, aperture rules, sort of. I was looking through Tim's 8-inch scope last night at Jupiter, and then I went over and looked at a friend's 100mm scope at Jupiter. There's a difference, and that aperture makes a difference in the fine resolution that you can resolve on the planet.
Excuse me, Richard.
Yeah.
When you're talking long focal lengths, give me an F number.
I'm going to get to that in a minute. If I don't, remind me again.
Okay.
Remind me again. All right, so we want better angular resolution, and you need to remember you are more affected by seeing, because the more your image scale is, the more things are going to be wiggling around. All right, so gear-wise, SCTs are really good for planets. Probably, this is again just my opinion. I also like vanilla better than chocolate, so take it for what it's worth. But a pure SCT is corrected right in the middle of the field. It collects a lot of light, has a lot of focal length, best bang for the buck if you want to shoot a planet. Why? Because a planet is a little bitty thing in the middle of the field. A raw SCT does not do very well for deep sky for a number of reasons. One is they're typically slow photographically. The other is their field is not very well corrected. What about Edge HD? Edge HD is not an SCT. It's a modified SCT. Edge HD is a nice flat field, great scope. I've had 2 of them. I didn't get rid of them because I didn't like them. I can only have so many scopes. My wife said, draw the line at 30. So I have to, I'll get something new. Something's got to go. But SCTs are really great for planets. For lunar, a modified SCT like an Edge HD works really good, or a Mac Cassegrain. I'm particular to Mac Cassegrains. I just like the optical design. I have a small one and it does really great. I also find if you've got a 6-inch or bigger refractor, it does pretty all right on the moon. Like I showed you the 0.1 arcsecond per pixel image a minute ago. That was also pretty okay. For solar, probably the best choice for solar is a refractor. Whether you're doing white light solar or you're doing HA solar, there are, of course, you can buy a scope that is only made for solar, and you'll find most of them are, refractor designs. I really like the vendors that, there are several vendors. Daystar is one of them, but, I can turn any of my refractors into a solar scope by either putting a white light filter on the front, or a Herschel wedge on the back, or a HA filter on the back, and those work really great, because you do not want a giant mirror collecting solar energy unless you are smelting iron or something at the bottom of your telescope. Let's go on and do best practices. Then I want to talk about that focal ratio. I don't know that I have a slide about that, but it's a good question. Some best practices. Take flats. I've got an example in a minute. I'll show you why you should take flats. People think they don't need to take flats. Well, Photoshop will fix it, but you'll get little dust donuts, and they will add features to the moon, and they will add features to your solar images. I think for planets, I mean, I can see the dust bunnies, and if the planet is between dust bunnies, all right, I might not worry about it. But I always have some globs, no matter how you clean it. I live in Florida. It's the pollen capital of the world. No matter what I do, I got globs on my filters or on my camera. And so I always take flats, even for lunar and solar, and usually even for planets. But you can kind of get away with it without. But I mean, if you just want to make a pretty picture and impress your girlfriend or boyfriend, fine. But if you want to say, this is an image that happened on this time, and I want to send it to Alpo or somebody and say, here's a record of what was going on the sun, or here's a record of the lunar terminator at this time and date, you better take flats, because your image is not accurate if you did not take flats. And it's not about vignetting. It's about there are things that will add to the surface.
Richard, is that flats or dark flat?
Well, okay, so flats are where you put, this is actually an example, Daystar this is white. So a flat is where you have a uniform light field coming into your optic, and it records, the variations in the light that your optic does. Yeah. And in order for flats to work correctly, really correctly, you should also take a dark flat or at least a bias. It depends on which sensor you have. A lot of times you can get away with a bias. But you need to subtract that offset from the camera from the flat, and then you need to do the same thing for your lights. But this isn't a talk about processing, but yeah, you should do flats properly is more or less what I'm saying. Yeah.
How do you do flats if you're doing solar images? I mean, I need an awful bright light to go through that filter. There may be dust on that filter. I want to.
Yeah. So solar flats. Two techniques that work well for me. If you're doing high resolution and you're zoomed in, just go to the center of the sun, and I'll put one of these flats on, and you'll get a nice flat field. If you're, does that make sense before I move on?
So how do you go to the center?
So like here's the sun,
Yeah.
and your camera's taking this much. All right, so you've got the sun, it's plenty bright.
Yeah.
Just put something like this in front to diffuse it, and you can make a good flat from that.
You've got space around the sun.
That's the challenge. So if you're doing full disk, what I actually do is I go to the full disk, and I'll take the flat with the disk in the middle. I did go to a presentation where somebody had this technique where you move all around the sun and you average them all together, and that's probably the better way to do it. My poor boy way to do it is I will just take a flat with the sun in the middle, and I'll use it to calibrate, and it works great over the sun, and you get all this garbage around the outside because you didn't really do it properly. But you know what? I don't care about the outside because there's nothing there. There's no sun there. There's no flares there. I don't care. So I've done that a few times, and it's worked out, fairly well. Shoot as high as possible. Another best practice when things are really low on the horizon. You're looking through a lot of atmosphere, and the atmosphere is moving around. It's like a really deep swimming pool with people doing cannonballs versus a very shallow pool where people are where the water is very still. When the seeing is really bad, this is a hard lesson to learn. Quit. Just go, yep, this ain't working tonight. 9 out of 10 of you, from my experience, will complain on the forum that our equipment is crap. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. A lot of time, it's just the seeing. The seeing is just bad. It doesn't, if you're collimated and you've got everything going, and sometimes the seeing is just really, really bad, there's no point trying. Right after a thunderstorm, you need to learn to read the weather a little bit. The clear sky clock will give you kind of an indication of how seeing is in your area, or maybe you could hire a meteorologist to tell you. Another great source of bad seeing, if there is such a thing, is heat. Your telescope needs to cool down probably for an hour or two before you're going to get good performance out of the telescope. Another key thing, I've been doing, one of the great things I don't mind telling people is I have done so many stupid things over like 40 years. And so I've learned everything the hard way. Taking a telescope out of a hot car and setting it up next to the star and then looking at Jupiter, you are not going to have a good experience. It needs to cool off, until it's not hot to the touch, at least, and even a lot more so after that, before you're going to get a good image. And the bigger your telescope, the longer it takes to cool. Okay. I had somebody was talking to me about Mac Newtonians. I had one of those. It was great, very front heavy because the meniscus is this thick. That's a big old heat sink. All right, think about those freezer blocks that you put in your cooler to keep things cool. It's a freezer block in reverse. You got this big hot thing putting heat out into your optical train. Hot parking lots. If you're doing outreach somewhere and you're setting up at Starbucks, the asphalt is hot and the heat is rising off of it, and so you need to kind of temper expectations a little bit. Depending on your focal length, if you're doing wide field viewing or you're looking at the moon, put in a low power eyepiece. If you're trying to do lucky imaging, don't use a long focal length because you're probably not going to get great results. 2 other personal experiences. Shooting over a hot house is a terrible idea. Even worse, blankety blank chimney. I'm following something and I'm like suddenly the scene just like, I'm watching this image and it's fairly decent, and then all of a sudden it's doing this. And then it gets worse and worse. It's like it's on fire. I'm like looking around and, oh, that's right. It's cold tonight. They lit a fire in the fireplace and I went right across the chimney, and boy, you can see it. It's just all over the place.
Richard?
Yeah.
One exception to shoot as high as you can, I have understood with the sea star, since a lot of people brought that, is you should try to stay between 30 degree and 65 degree, because if you go higher, you get more field rotation.
Okay. So Denise was asking about shooting really high, a problem with shooting really high, and she brought up the sea star. So the sea star is an alt-az-mount doing long exposures, several seconds. We're taking exposures that are tenths or hundredths or thousandths of a second. So we do not care about field exposure with lucky imaging. The software, if Jupiter rotates a little bit, the software, should straighten all that up for you. So that's a really good habit to be in for deep sky that will get in your way when you switch to lucky imaging. So I'm glad you brought that up as a good proviso. Seeing's not also the only enemy. You would be surprised. Trucks driving by. When I was working at Software Bisque and I had a prototype Paramount Mighty, something's wrong with this Mighty, Steve. It's tracking fine, and then all of a sudden it starts jerking all over the place. And after a while it'll quit and it tracks for a while. It's cable drag, it's software, it's everything. I went a week, all right, telling my boss, one of the greatest engineers in astro imaging, something's wrong with this mount. You know what it was? It was my AC unit coming on and going off. And it would come on and it shook the ground and you could see it. You could see it in the guider graph if you're doing deep sky stuff. When I'm shooting the planets, I can see it comes on. Even when my neighbor's comes on, Mars starts doing this because the neighbor's AC unit came on and it's vibrating the ground. If you get up and walk around, you can see that planet bouncing around, and that's degrading your image, and that's going to make things harder for you. So now I turn the AC off, and I come out and I image, and then I forget to turn the AC on, and in the morning I have another uncomfortable conversation with my wife. So walking around on concrete, set up on grass or dirt is much better, especially if you can shoot over grass or dirt or trees. I think the only thing better to shoot over, pay attention, is the ocean. So that's why you can get, yeah.
The ocean would be radiating a ton of heat if it's hot there.
You would think. You would think. There are tripod foot pads. I've heard that they work. I got some and then put, an 80-pound mount on it with a 50-pound tripod, and it didn't work so well. it kind of squished, and I got to see what the insides were made of. But they may work for you with a lighter setup. And then another thing is when you're recording the video files, I highly recommend you use lossless video and not compressed video. The way the compression algorithms work is it looks for things that are similar and it combines them, and they're designed for video where I'm walking around and the background isn't much changing, and when you give it a video of doing this sort of thing, you're adding all sorts of noise and artifacts to your image. Yep.
I don't know what that is, and I've been doing this for a long time. Are AVI files lossless?
So the file format is not an indication of what we call the codec. So there is a lossless AVI. You can do lossless with AVI. I don't use AVIs because I do things on Mac and Linux all the time. But everybody supports SER, and so I just always recommend SER. Plus, if you select AVI, I don't know your software. It may be a compressed AVI. It may not be a compressed AVI.
How could you tell?
You'd have to, yeah, file size would be a good indicator, and I'd have to dig into it, your software, and see. So I don't know how to tell you. So you know what? Use SER.
Yeah.
Unless you've been using AVI and it works for you and you're happy, in which
And
case.
here's another thing, because we have this conversation all the time between amateurs. Everybody says, well, okay, I'm going to shoot SCRs and I'm going to shoot at 16-bit resolution. And here I'm shooting at 8-bit on an AVI. And I've done both. And yes, the FITS SCR, you're going to get a huge file. But you know what? When I put it together, I can't tell the difference. When I get the final image, people can't tell me the difference between which picture was an AVI file of mine and which picture was SCR fit.
So yeah, the 16 versus 8-bit. Let's go ahead and rewind a little bit. This may be on the slides later, but first let's talk about the focal ratio thing. Another thing about focal ratio, and I probably should have made a slide about this, is unless you're doing solar and you have a filter that requires a certain focal ratio really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your focal ratio is when you're shooting Jupiter. What matters is your pixel scale and the aperture of your scope. So it's like, well, I shot Jupiter at f30. I'm like, well, great. What's your image scale? I mean, how big a picture of Jupiter was it? Focal ratio is just a geometric relation between the focal length and the aperture of your telescope. Now, it really matters with HA filters because when that light comes and it hits that filter, you want that light to be as parallel as possible for the filter to work. And f30 is a really nice steep line coming in. If you try to shoot the moon the sun at f4 with the HA filter, that light's going to be coming into the filter like this. And in the very center, you're going to get really good performance, and then all the rest of it is going to fall off and be very bad. But it's easy to talk about focal length and focal ratio, and I think people got into the habit of going, well, you know, a large focal ratio means it's highly magnified. It doesn't. A large focal length means it's highly magnified, not a large focal ratio. I stop down things all the time to get a high focal ratio, but at a short focal length. So the focal ratio, really important for solar, not nearly as important as most people think it is for the moon and planets. The other thing you brought up, I'll go ahead and mention now. The 8-bit versus, no I won't. I do have a slide about the 8-bit versus 16. We'll just kind of table that for a minute. Getting on target. Again, these things are very tiny. Planets can be hard. Buy yourself a Paramount or an AP and you're done. You just slew to the tiny little planet with a tiny little sensor and you're good to go. If that doesn't work for you, use a lower power, center it. All the time, not with my Paramount of course, but all the time I'll center something in the eyepiece and then I'll swap to the camera, and it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to find. Another thing you can do, you'd be surprised how good a frame rate you can get from a large format camera when you make a very small region of interest. Not so great on the moon and the sun because I usually want a big picture of the sun and the moon, but when I have Jupiter, on a 7,000 by 4,000 pixel sensor, I can make a little box around Jupiter that's like 800 pixels by 800 pixels, and I can get a couple of hundred frames per second on that planet. Now, a large format sensor is, a little bit more expensive than a planetary camera with a small one, but it is an option, and you may not have thought, to try that yourself. Here's another example of why you should do flats. So, oh no. Okay, I haven't gotten to that yet. 16-bit or 8-bit, that's what this slide is about. On paper, deeper is always better, right? You have more dynamic range. If you're detecting very faint signal, it helps with something we call quantization problems. So, a nice 16-bit camera with a nice deep well, that's always going to be better on paper. In my opinion, just my opinion, not Randy's opinion, and he's a very accomplished imager, and doesn't mean either one of us are wrong. I think 8-bit is fine for planets. You really don't have a lot of dynamic range on planets. I mean, you just don't. But I like 16-bit better for the moon and the sun. I started doing this on the moon, and this is some of, that's what this is. See these little white blotchy areas? I really don't like the white blotchy areas on my lunar images. And so you have to expose for a very short amount of time so that nothing gets overexposed, and then all the other areas are very dark. With a full well and a 16-bit sensor, you can expose a little bit longer before those saturate, and you've collected more light in the dark areas in your individual exposures. On the sun, if you want to image the corona and the flares, if you want to get all of that, I find 16-bit, I find it's much easier. It could be Randy's a better processor than me, would not doubt it. But it could be, I have a much easier time getting the surface of the sun and the flares when I shoot 16-bit versus 8-bit, because I have a much higher dynamic range, all captured within the frame at one time. I had this discussion with another imager friend of mine. He's like, I get flares, they're easy. He showed me his flares, and his flares were all flat. So I'm like, yeah, you got flares, but they're flat. They're like little cardboard cutouts of the flare. They don't have that depth. I cannot say that about Randy, though. I'm not even looking at him, because I've seen his flares. His flares are pretty decent, and he's telling me he's shooting 8-bit. Great. It's easier for me to shoot 16, so that's what I recommend people to do. How do you know what exposure to get? Another thing that I do, especially on the moon, is I want to get as many exposures as possible. So, I mean, you've got a camera, you've got a computer. How many frames per second can you get? Because you want it to be as fast as possible to freeze that seeing in the individual exposures. So I'll turn the exposure time down. How far can I go before it stops getting faster? All right, I'm down to 200 frames a second. I slide it a little more, it's 200 frames a second. I slide it a little more, it's 200 frames a second. I'm not getting any extra frames per second, and I'm cutting off the light. So I'll crank the light back up by lengthening the exposure. I'm at the maximum frame rate my hardware can deliver. Is it bright enough? I'll drag the gain out a little bit to brighten it up. A thing to be careful with gain is there's two types of gain. One is a hardware gain built into the chip. It's really good gain. It can help with noise problems. Another type of gain is, well, here's the number. Let's just multiply it by 3 and make it brighter. That's bad gain. We don't want that kind of gain applied to our image. Where that is depends on the camera manufacturer. Nobody's software is going to tell you what that is either. You're going to have to look up your camera or maybe talk to your manufacturer and say, so what's really the maximum practical gain for my camera? Yep, and so that's what I just said. How we doing? All right, 20 minutes. I can blather all day. SSD drives, more best practices and tips. Internal SSDs are way faster than hard disk drives. So if you think about it, you're streaming all this data over USB 3 and you got to save it on your computer. And this is a great computer. I spent $300 at Walmart, and it's great for surfing the web and Facebook and Netflix. That hard drive is not going to like having all that data dumped onto it at a very fast pace. I'll tell you another secret. The low-end laptops, they also chintz on the USB implementation, so the USB isn't very fast either, or if you plug too many things into them, they tend to burst into flames. Not really, but I just want you to not do that. External SSDs actually run quite fast, especially if you have a good USB implementation. SSD. My wife tells me this all the time. I'm using acronyms. What is SSD? Solid State Disk Drive.
M.2s are faster.
Yeah. So you've got a spinning platter on a traditional hard drive and a little head. It's like a really, really fast 8-track tape player, right? So an SSD it's digital. It's just writing to memory, and yes, M2 yes, there are other options that are even better. But SSDs are really cheap. You can get them on Amazon and plug them in. So they're very fast. You can save locally, process with it tethered to your laptop, and you'll be very happy. They're usually rated in XXMB per second. MB stands for megabytes or megabits, depending on who you're looking at. But bigger is better. Wider is better. Let me just go back to that.
What's your opinion of the ASI Air as far as
What the heck does that have to do with Lucky Imaging?
downloading to it? Doing
Oh.
a video feed to it? Is it
I've not tried an ASI for video. Yeah, I've not tried. I do know the Pi 4 does pretty good with software that I wrote. And the Pi 5 is even better. I will give away a little freebie. A Pi 5 based planetary solar lunar imaging device would give an ASI a run for its money in terms to this kind of imaging. Yeah. Take flats. I mean it. Here's an image of the moon. It's very beautiful. It's great, isn't it? There's Tycho. You can see the rays. Look at all that detail. The rays coming from Tycho. There's little dark areas and light areas. And this is really great. If you're into observing the moon, you really want to know about this. The light areas are, titanium oxide, and they're younger than the dark areas. And you can get this nice, interplay of light, and you get a really good representation of the lunar surface. Except you are a big fat liar. So can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, so like right here, little dark areas, you can't tell. This is every time somebody says, "Oh, I don't bother with flats," I'm like, you never tried flats, did you? Because you can tell. You absolutely can tell on maybe on planets, all right? Maybe, unless you had a big dust bunny in the middle of Mars. But on the moon and on the sun, you absolutely can tell, and it will absolutely change what it looks like if you don't take flats. So take flats. I mean it, really. Big fat liar. All right. Software. There's a lot of software. I only like a couple of them. Those are the ones I'm going to talk about. SharpCap, Windows only. Probably my favorite capture software. I haven't used it in a while, but it is good. I haven't used it in a while because, hint, hint, I'm doing something else. Fire Capture is another good alternative. I didn't like the user interface as much, but it does run on a Mac. So right now, if you want to do planetary or if you want to do Lucky Imaging on a Macintosh, Fire Capture is the only option you have for now. I don't know how to be there's just nothing else that I've tried that I've liked. It's just any good. Better things are coming though. Stacking software. I think the gold standard is AutoStackert. It stacks and aligns just the best parts of the frame, like we were talking earlier. It can produce a sharpened image. I saw a guy giving a talk on solar image processing, and all he did was use AutoStackert, and it spit out a sharpened image, and he quit. And he was happy. And if you're happy, that's fine. And it was a nice image. But if you want to go that extra mile, you certainly can. But AutoStackert will do that for you.
Is that both Windows and Apple?
No, AutoStackert is also only Windows. I run it on a virtual machine on my Mac, though. So I can run it on my Mac. but you need Parallels or VM Fusion or something like that. Um,
Yeah, boot camp went away.
yeah, Boot Camp went away. That's fine. I don't want to reboot my computer, my Mac, to use a Windows program. So I like having something called Parallels. Any Mac people here? Am I talking to? Okay. Parallels Fusion, great. Even on Apple Silicon, Windows 11 for ARM emulates x86. The rest of you just think about daisies or something. But it's actually really fast and quite usable. And so I run AutoStacker on Parallels on an Apple Silicon Mac, and it runs really great, and it's plenty fast. It doesn't hurt that I have 64 gig of RAM, but it's plenty fast. It is still actively, I thought it might be abandonware, but he just released a new version 4 months ago. The other one is Registax. This is the grand patriarch. It's been around forever. It does align and stack. It does something called wavelet sharpening, which is a sharpening technique to take that blurry image and turn it into something sharp. Many people still prefer it. It's often the only thing Registrax is used for. They'll use AutoStacker to stack, and then they'll go in because they love those wavelets to sharpen things. It is also Windows only. You can do it on PixInsight with yeah. You can do it with PixInsight. The Registrax interface might be a little better, and I don't like wavelets at all, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It's being replaced by WaveSharp. WaveSharp is like it's on the Registax webpage, but it's all different people. So I think it's just like, hey, we're doing this, and you haven't worked on Registax in how many years has it been? It's been a lot of years. Why don't you like promote our thing? So it's cross-platform-ish. It's a whole new development team. They're updating it fairly regularly. There is native Windows and Linux. Do we have any Linux people in here? Yeah, that's what I thought. Oh, okay. All right, good. All right, yay.
Richard,
Yes?
would you do me a favor?
Yes?
Would you go back to, just real quick, just for a second?
You want to take a picture of this or?
Yes. I was waiting for it to get populated completely.
Gotta focus.
Fast. Thank
All right,
you.
good
I
deal.
got it.
Good deal. Let's see. They had a native Mac version for a while. There's still a way to run it on a Mac for my Mac friends, but it requires you to install Fusion and do a whole bunch of weird things. It used to be open source. You could download the source code. They took the source code down. So I don't know what's up with that. This is actually my favorite program for sharpening. IMPPG, Image Post Processor. It is also Windows only, but it runs great in a virtual machine on the Mac. And it is open source, and they have a Linux version as well. This is free Windows. Okay, this is, in my opinion, the best for lunar and solar. I just love this to death. It uses, just let me get on ahead here. Yeah, works great for planets too. The latest version works great for planets. This does not use wavelets. It uses something called deconvolution. Now, at the beginning, I told you my field of expertise is graphics programming and stuff. And I used to work at a medical imaging software company, and they worked on, they did eye stuff. And I learned about convolution and deconvolution in the refractive eye surgery market. Wavelets, now this is just my opinion, but it is an educated opinion. Wavelets are a great way to sharpen things, but it's arbitrary. You can just slide those sliders and make things as sharp as you want until it looks really pretty or it looks like what you want it to look like. And that's fine, because most of the time, if you've been practicing, it's pretty close to what it is. I like convolution and deconvolution because that's actually how the physics of light works. And it is still a slider that you're moving. So it is still a little bit subjective. But at least you're sliding a real physical, you're doing something real when you're moving that slider back and forth to make something sharper or dimmer when you do that. That's a personal preference. I wouldn't impose that on anybody, but that's why I don't use, wavelets are great. Like I said, again, if you got a picture of a giraffe and you want to make it sharp, that's great. For scientific imaging, I would just kind of like, I would rather use convolution and deconvolution. Yes? I tried Blur Exterminator on moon images. It was horrible. It could be I have the wrong settings. I love Blur Exterminator for deep sky stuff. It's a great product. And I'm like, it wasn't trained on the moon, but let's throw it in there and see what happens. And it was not pretty. At the very beginning, I told you about shot noise, right? So the longer the exposure, the more light you collect. The more light you collect, the more signal you have. The more signal you have, the more noise you have, which is what, wait, what? Yes, you get more noise and more signal, but the noise increases slower than the signal. So you get lots and lots of signal, and the noise is kind of lagging along, and they get further and further apart, and you get a nice clean image. Another soapbox is that graph I showed you has nothing to do with how many exposures you have. That's right, 16 exposures are all you need. Well, are there 16 1-second exposures or 16 10-minute exposures? It's like saying I have more money in the bank because I made more deposits. Kind of matters, how much your deposit was. I could set up a little bot that would donate, would deposit a penny a minute or something. Actually, I'd still run out of money pretty quick if I did that. Anyway, one of the great things about Lucky Imaging is we can do 2 minutes worth of video, and we collect a lot of signal. And if you have a nice clean image, you can sharpen that image and get a good representation of what the object really looks like, even beyond the diffraction limit. You're cheating, you're not really beating the diffraction, but you are reproducing a pretty faithful image beyond what you could do just from the diffraction limit. But make sure you've got a nice sharp, a nice clean image. If you sharpen a noisy image, wow, that's so crisp. You've heard it, haven't you? Some of those crisp images. If you want to do that anyway, because it's art, that's fine. Another thing I hate is it's just art. Art is great. There's nothing wrong with art, you Neanderthal. Art is a wonderful thing. It's a part of human civilization. Just don't call it a photograph if it's art. That's all I ask. So again, this only works with low noise image. To get this to this, you've got to have a very low noise image for that to work. All right, what about deep sky? Can we do Lucky Imaging with deep sky? I don't know. Remember this graph? It's all about the signal. So 1 30-minute exposure, you get lots of signal. All right, a little bit of noise. Sometimes you can quit, depending on what you're shooting. That's great, but we don't do that. We take lots of shorter exposures and we stack them together. So is 1 30-minute exposure the same as 31-minute exposures? Maybe. Well, what about 1,800 1-second exposures? Could I do that? Maybe. Where do you draw the line? How do you know where that cutoff is? How short can you go? It's all about the noise floor of your individual images. And the noise floor of individual images 15 years ago said, you'd better expose for several minutes at least for each sub-exposure. But that has changed. Cameras have gotten better, and that noise floor is dropping, and it keeps getting lower and lower. Read noise started going down with CMOS, another soapbox. The read noise is so low, you should be able to do Lucky Imaging with the CMOS. But read noise is not the only source of noise in a camera. Dark pattern noise was so bad, especially in the early CMOSs, that I was definitely in the CCD is better than CMOS crowd until the last possible moment. And this is one of the reasons, was the CMOS sensors still had a lot of that dark pattern noise. I can't say that anymore. There's talks I gave at this thing. I can never give that talk again because it's not true anymore. The CMOS has definitely caught up with CCD. I did a controlled experiment, private experiment. Let me just go ahead and put all these up there. I can tell you a little bit about what I did. 5 minutes worth of 1-second exposures versus 1 5-minute exposure. This is on a modern camera. I won't tell you what sensor it is. But it was at f7 on the Crab Nebula, because that's important too. What are you shooting? And how bright is it? And how focused is the light coming from the camera? It's not just about from the object. It's not just about the camera. But in this experiment, I can tell you, you know, 1 second exposures still aren't enough. We probably can't do a lot of great deep sky stuff with one. I could get the Crab Nebula, but you gotta get a lot of those 1 second exposures versus like even a 30-second exposure of the Crab Nebula. The 30-second exposure was better. 12 by 5 seconds, however, was as good as a 1 minute exposure, and 60 by 5 seconds was as good as a 5-minute exposure. You know what that means? On the Crab Nebula only, with that sensor only, and at f7, 5 seconds is enough. 5 seconds was enough. I could do lots of 5-second exposures, and it was the same as auto guiding for 10 minutes, you know, to get, you know. Now, don't make this mistake. If you need 3 hours on a target to get a good clean image, you still need 3 hours on a target. There's only so much light coming from the Crab Nebula. You still need to collect all that light. But what this is I can collect the light in buckets that aren't losing a lot of the light. And so I can collect the light in little buckets instead of having to have a big bucket. And that makes a difference because it means things like C-star are possible. C-star takes 10-second exposures on most things. And over time, that will get better. Will we ever get to where we can do 1 second exposures on anything we want? Probably even within our lifetimes, maybe even less than a second. We could see that. The jump between the first 2 generations of CMOS, several generations of CMOS and the current generation of CMOS is really amazing. And that noise at the bottom, when they get that down there, we're going to make that next leap forward. By the way, you know, I work in high tech. I got 3 minutes. Nobody cares about astronomy in the world, all right? Just us. What's driving all of this is not getting better pictures of the Crab Nebula. It's getting better pictures of that guy next to your shed in the backyard. It's getting better pictures of license plates when they run red lights or they run through somebody's yard and then take off. Security cameras and phone cameras, that's driving all of this technology forward. We're getting the breadcrumbs, but those markets are billion, trillion-dollar markets. So it's going to happen. It's not worth it for us. Nobody's going to put this kind of investment into it for us, blankety blanks. All right, so sort of you can still sort of do lucky imaging. Take lots of short exposures, throw away the bad ones. You know, how short can you go? Depends on the noise. I'm going to speed up here. The limit on how long those can be, you know, is going to change. Anybody doing this already? Well, you want a list. You've probably seen this and this and this and this and this and this and maybe one of these guys. So yeah, lucky imaging is sort of seeping its way into deep sky right now. Okay, 2 minutes left. All right. There's always some guy in the back, some old codger. Forgive me. I mean no offense to any codgers, but there's somebody. About narrowband, young man. You got to go long and deep with narrowband. That sounded better before I said it out loud. And he's right. All right, narrowband is a lot less light, but this is 60-second exposures with a 3-nanometer filter at f7. It's still, you know, over 2 hours of exposure time. And individual subs, I couldn't even see this. I did this, you know, I did it on M42. By the way, stop being impressed with M42. Oh, look, M42 and 1 second exposures. M42, other than the moon, is like the brightest freaking thing in the sky, all right? Everybody uses M42. This is a very dim HA object. And I did M42 and I did Rosette. I did several objects. I did just a little bit of time. And 1 60-second exposure, I could see it. And then I did this, and it's like, there's nothing here. I'm like, you're a scientist. Let it run for a couple hours and see what happens. And I let it run for a couple hours and see what happens. So it's coming for your narrowband guys too. It's 2 o'clock. I'm done. I'm running over.